thanks to my colleagues here, industry panelists. You've been a big part of what makes the Health Tech Challenge successful. Many of you have been all over the world to partake in seeing hundreds of these startups. And it's great to see the innovation in those startups, but what's much harder, of course, is when you go back to your companies, is to make innovation work at your company. Because, of course, you're not in a greenfield spot, you're in a brownfield spot, and you have the challenge of making digital health, digital and technology come alive in an innovative way in a corporation. Quite a different challenge. It's not about finding investment, it's about finding budget. It's not about finding talent, it's about co-opting people in the organization. And I want to get it to the bottom of that with you a little bit today. I'm going to start off with Wanho. I think Wanho, from a Bristol Myers Squibb perspective, talk broadly, don't feel the need to speak about BMS, because we know you guys have been busy just over the holidays. It's just a little bit busy. Congratulations, nice deal. You've done a lot of experiments, a lot of digital health experiments, but really the challenge is, out of those experiments, the successes, how do you scale those? Maybe you could talk about how you scale innovation. I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about making innovation successful for a corporation.
Thank you, Stuart. And yes, we were very busy from the Christmas period. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I said, thank you, Stuart. Yes, we were very busy during this Christmas period. The topic of escalating innovation is a complex one. What we do at BMS is we stay true of what it is our mission, which is simply to discover medicines, develop them, and then deliver them to patients. So by doing that, we stay very true on what are we doing and what are we not doing. So we choose very selectively, we choose investments that helps us either to advance science or add data to our decisions or deploy technology, or do it all together so that we can either discover the more molecules or develop them faster or change the way that we interact with our customers, either they are HCPs, payers, or patients. To do that, we also choose, and I would say that's even more important, we choose not to do a lot of things. So we basically are working on 3 very specific areas where we have massive investment, and we choose not to do other things. Like, for instance, we tend to get pulled over all the time to do things around blockchain. We choose not to do anything on blockchain, and we are very specific about that. However, in other areas, we do have massive investment. And this massive investment is jointly decided, IT, research, marketing, with a lot of collaboration and very strict governance.
Just as you think about scaling innovation, you think about, you sit down with, in the commercial role, and you say, hey, I could add 3 more people to a territory to go drive Opdivo sales. Or I could spend 300,000, 900,000 on trying to scale a startup. How do you make those trade-offs? Because I get the feeling that every day the old gets up and tries to squash the new. So I don't know if you know the leading cause of the death of baby pandas. I think you've heard me say this before. It's mummy pandas, because they sit on them because they don't realize they're there. And I think this is how old crushes the new every day. Maybe you could tell me about how you make sure baby pandas are safe.
What we do at BMS is we are very disciplined, and you know that. We are extremely disciplined on what we are pursuing, and we work together in making those decisions. So once we have made a decision, we go and execute, and we are extremely disciplined on the execution. So, and we do not allow things to deviate us until we get the actual result and the learnings out of that. If things doesn't go well, we fail fast and move on. But we're very, very disciplined through collaboration and joint decision.
Perfect. That's a great one.
Thank you.
Amy, maybe just switching gears a little bit. One of the things that I think is hard is you can innovate in a vacuum. You can do stuff. You can run projects. But in actual fact, making sure it connects really closely with the business is something I think you've done really well in your role at GSK. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've got innovation happening really close to the business and the brands in a way that's making an impact in the business. Maybe not at the scale where it's having a P&L impact in the short term, but you can see your line of sight to making a complete difference in terms of the way GSK runs its business, which I think, as I listened to Emma, talk about GSK this morning. Very exciting. You must be, enjoying being part of that revolution at GSK.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit of change happening at GSK, and I'm in their consumer healthcare division. So what we're trying to do when I came into the job now about 15 months ago, it was clear to a few of us that we weren't doing enough of kind of structure around innovation, right? And so we really looked at what do we want to do, spin up a separate unit and have it far away from the business and kind of isolated, but
that's kind of the established logic, isn't it? Keep it away so that it
well,
can thrive
so we
don't get squashed.
Yeah, or did we want to keep it closer so that there'd be less kind of autoimmune response of trying to spit it out, right, when it got developed. And I think based off of some scars each of us had from our past lessons, we decided to keep it close, but to ring fence the money in such a way that the unit has decisions and they don't always have to go right to the day in, day out category elements or category structure. I think the really important thing we did is we decided that no one group would own innovation. It would be co-owned by our head of R&D, me as the CIO for the business unit, and our chief digital officer. So the three of us really run that unit as a three-headed monster, as we say, or the three,
It's not a monster, Amy.
Yeah,
it's not a
monster. It feels like a monster some days. So, I think by having those elements and close enough to the business with the right leadership doesn't mean that it's not without its issues, but we have been able to more rapidly bring concepts through, and then we always have the concept that we will have a lead market who is bought in, and if we don't, after we get to kind of a point in the innovation cycle, we'll kick it out, because we have to be
when you've got someone
able
who's going to pull.
We have to be able to test it somewhere, right? And I mean, we can't test it just in a vacuum. So that's how we've gone after innovation. I mean, we have some pretty significantly different things that we're pulling through that will come into our pipeline with P&L impacts in 19 and 20 in the connected device space and things that are directly sold to the consumer.
Where's the space in that model for kind of entrepreneurship? How do you fit that in? Because I was talking to the CEO of another company on the weekend, and they were talking about how they had to have some entrepreneurial spirit in there to make stuff happen, but they need to provide protection around it, and then how they help those entrepreneurs find their ways in corporations, which can be quite the opposite kind of place for someone to thrive in that entrepreneurship role.
Yeah, so I think probably our head of the digital innovation lab, who you know quite well, we actually stole them from Accenture. I think he would tell you that some days he wants to bang his head against the wall, right? And he had done some startup things and others before that. And he has to learn how to live in a big company, and that brings with it, certain challenges, I guess. But in general, what we try to do is we really try to give the space, and we try to follow, design thinking and other methodology to really be able to show that value. And in every case, what we're building right now, we're doing with a startup company, either licensing something or purchasing, right? So we're not starting necessarily from scratch. We're taking an area we're interested in and finding the best tech and the best kind of way of doing it and bringing it together through an acquisition or something else.
So those startups provide you some of that entrepreneurship into GSK, the kind of the spark that changes things. That's fair to say?
I mean, fair to say.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good. I'd like to switch the conversation a little bit, because, of course, what you've talked a little bit there about is operating model and how the operating model changes. And Addison, I wanted to kind of put you on the spot. From an operating model perspective, how do you change your operating model so that you can bring startups in and make a difference? And in that context, how do you use the operating model to advance the cause of innovation in a corporation, in a world where things move a little bit slower than they do here in the Valley?
Right. So, again, this space that you all are in is fantastic, from the standpoint, it doesn't probably feel like that every day, because, you're trying to sell, you're trying to pitch, you're trying to get somebody to listen to you, trying to understand what you've got going on. But sometimes also inside of this, large organization, the mothership, there's, I would call it a natural inclination to kind of deprioritize and kind of and push off things that don't seem like they're ready for action. So let me tell a quick story in this. I remember when probably about 4 years ago or so, I went into our CEO at the time's office, and we were in the midst of the Affordable Care Act activity, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And, you know, I pitched at that point, I said, you know, when we get done with solving, you know, all of these things that are costing us, you know, investment focus at this point in time, we're going to need a system, a platform to kind of help us leap forward, because we've been focusing our energy on creating a new line, 2 lines of business at the same time with the existing line of business that we had, and creating more scale and capacity. And so I remember looking at her, and that meeting was supposed to go for 30 minutes. It went for 45. At the end of it, she didn't wear her feelings on her face very much, but I was definitely in the process of updating my resume on the way out, because I felt like I had told her that, you know, the holy grail of focusing on kind of the operational priority was not where innovation should be focused. And so, of course, I felt a little uncomfortable about my departure. Roll the clock forward 12 hours later, I get an email from her that basically says, hey, thank you so much for challenging my perspective. You're absolutely right. We need to start somewhere. And, you know, your ideas around stimulating the spaces that we actually have opportunities to influence at this point in time, doing things a little differently than we maybe have traditionally done, is spot on. So you got to remember that let's call it the operating system for the mothership and the operating system for the innovation platform, they operate at different speeds. And you're going to have to figure out how to bring those two you know, gears or whatnot together. You know, there's this kind of white space that sits in between there, because there are things that are constantly being prioritized, and you try to typically inject incremental innovation, but that only moves you so far, so fast. And so a lot of times you have to kind of figure out how to strategically identify domains or areas of opportunity, like we were just talking about, that you invest that are kind of tied to your strategic mission and vision, but you have some freedom to run. And so that's what we've been able to do, specifically as of late, where going back, you know, when we first started having the conversation, we didn't really have a quote-unquote formal innovation model, to today where we've got, you know, two major platforms, you know, a lab that actually co-creates with our clients. We have a employee-driven innovation and idea incubator that actually has put 2 new things in the pipeline into the marketplace, you know, in 19, which is really exciting. Actually, one thing got there faster than we had planned. So, you know, looking at you know, how to then position this from a priority perspective, along with the rest of the things that are already earmarked for investment, is kind of key. And then also then having kind of a leadership team that also invests itself around acknowledging, supporting, sponsoring, and actually challenging themselves, because also, you know, remember, they are held to the metal of, you know, operating and delivering on the P&L for their specific areas of responsibility. And so here come these innovation guys that are going to be a little disruptive and not necessarily have a guarantee. They may have some you know, some leading informatics around what the potential could be, but not necessarily things that are kind of close to the metal of the individuals who have these responsibilities. So you get them to start sponsoring these things, and then you actually start to see, as 1 or 2 of these things start to evolve, the courage starting to come up. And so the culture of the organization then starts to change slowly. And that operating system that I kind of talked about, they start to get more in sync now with each other. And then they actually start looking into, hey, those innovation guys, they actually were able to do this X, Y, and Z thing before. Can we tap on them to kind of bring them into the front end of these new project cycles that we have?
Got it.
So.
Let me test you a little bit, because one of the things I want to ask you about is innovation is what? It's risky, isn't it?
Yeah, very.
So when you take innovation and you take risk, there are times when it's successful.
Right.
And there are times when it's unsuccessful.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment when it's unsuccessful, and they go, those innovation guys screwed it up. In corporations, normally failure and firing are 2 things that go quite close together. Sometimes days apart, sometimes maybe tacitly it might take a few weeks or a month to find out you've been fired, but it goes wrong, doesn't it? It goes wrong badly. How in your operating model have you created space for innovation, entrepreneurship, but also allowed for actually there's almost a, we need to be failing a certain amount of the time, otherwise we're probably not pushing hard enough. How have you done that in the operating model?
Right. So.
And if there's anyone who was fired in the audience for that, feel free to let us know, and maybe Addison could tell us how to stay safe.
Yeah, we can have an intervention, afterwards and kind of talk about that. No, I think the thing is you set up the expectation that these are the level of investment, first of all, that you commit yourself to. Again, depending upon the size and the complexity of the organizations. We've been able to kind of, how should I say, not de-risk, because you don't necessarily de-risk innovation, but you do look at it from the standpoint of, what can we get out quickly? What can we, what hypothesis can we test and validate very quickly and make sure that at least this piece is something that we, either learn from, or then we can, try to force it to failure. So that's really kind of been our, maybe secret sauces. We've failed a lot of things. We've tried to force them to failure, and then some things kind of reincarnate themselves while you're trying to kill them. So that's the other side of it too, where they take on another life. They may take a turn in the process of saying, okay, the success criteria that you defined for this particular capability, we're done looking at that, but this other very interesting thing happened. And so then having the organizational tolerance to kind of explore that new path actually helped us identify some capabilities that we would not have got on our runway. So to your point, I think the organization has to, if they're formally embracing innovation, they have to know that they should be failing a lot more than they're actually delivering,
Yep.
because you should be doing testing at the level where it is not making significant impact, to the bottom line until, it's actually ready to go to market. So you should have that space so that you can actually experiment with confidence. And then that also starts to change the culture and evolve what you do as well.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the concept of failure, because in actual fact, in most big pharma and biotech companies, we embrace failure every day. And I want to move to clinical trials and talk a little bit to Nancy about clinical trials. So in the context of clinical trials, as we know, from first in man through regulatory, the chances of success are anything between 4 and 8 if you play the averages, 11 to 15 if you start to look at some of the different breakout. But essentially, you're lucky if 1 in 10 of the molecules you take into first in man make it to the market. And we do those clinical trials because scientifically we have to learn. So ironically, here we are on one side, anything with digital, we hold to, in corporations, we hold to some sort of high standard for, we can't have failure there, but it's juxtaposed to clinical trials. And the question I really want to ask you, Nancy, is if we think about clinical trials, a big part of those is the cost of failure. In phase 3, we can spend, anything between $500 million and $1 billion on a big study. If we talk about Alzheimer's, we're talking about billions of dollars. Even a good 2B, 3A study for oncology, we're in the $50 to $150 million to run those studies. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about how are we going to, using digital, in our industry, and I'm not asking you to talk about Gilead, I don't want to talk about your company, but across the industry, how do we get 100x cheaper, 100x faster, 100x higher quality in clinical trials? I set a ridiculous number because, of course, I think that's the kind of level of change we're going to have to do in order to change the way we do clinical trials, in order to get medicines to patients faster in a way that really has put them in a situation where we know it's going to work for this patient. Maybe you could talk about that.
Sure. So I'm going to focus it in on a very real life example. So we took a look at a particular therapeutic class of very, very sick patients. And so our primary goal actually was not around the money. It was around how do we improve the patient experience so that the outcome at the end of the day is going to help this patient's journey achieve the ultimate health outcome. And
that's hard because typically we come at clinical trial design from a very scientific perspective.
Yep.
To come at it from an experience perspective, that probably took some people's heads and you press the button which blows their heads up, isn't it? That's quite different.
It was a very interesting concept. So what we ended up doing, and see how many people are in this room. So when we said we were going to try to do clinical trial disruption, the first meeting had about this many people in the room.
Some stakeholders.
Regulatory and quality and compliance.
Legal.
All being in the room. Well, legal is like, it'll never happen, so they didn't show up.
Okay, they didn't show up.
So the long and short of it is we looked at 3 priorities. Patient first, time to market, and then cost. And the reason we did that is that why we come to work every day is to save patients' lives. And all of us had been following these patients for so long and making very intimate relationships with them and watching them go through these painful journeys just to go for a treatment visit to get blood pressure, weight, and vitals. These folks sometimes can't get out of bed for 3 weeks, physically cannot get out of bed. They would have to actually get a transport for 2-hour drive just to get these basic vitals. And we said to ourselves, is this the right thing to be doing? And we challenged ourselves, we said no. So what we ended up doing is actually we ran the trial in a parallelism, traditional, and it was a 33 treatment protocol, which had to go to actually your visit 33 times. And as a very sick person, I mean, geez, when we get a cold, we don't even want to get out of bed. But these are folks, they're on their last 4 months of life. So we actually submitted a prototype to the FDA about running this in parallel. And the goal was to reduce the 33 treatment regimen by 50%. We still were going to do 33 visits, but we were going to do them virtually. And we were going to do that with disruptive, innovation, and digital.
So half the visits would be done without them having to come into the investigator's office?
Yep.
Wow.
So what we ended up doing is, in the protocol, we hardwired that we were going to do this, and we had a control group. So they were going on traditional, equivalent to, I'll call it my digital patients, and they were going to get, 50-50 split of virtual visits. Now, the virtual visits really were, I'll call them the simple visits. It's really those simple little things. With an iPad, a physician can very easily do some visual tests to determine your disease progression. That is not a reason to make someone drive 2 hours and then wipe them out so bad their white blood counts go down and they can't get out of bed now for the next month because they went to that visit.
Well, they have to come in for an infusion.
Yeah, and all of these things. So, we were able to take I always like to call them, there's always these little easy wins in the treatment protocol, the 15-minute visits. How do we get those 15-minute visits virtual? So we ended up creating a very, very simple digital technology with an iPad application that the doctor would have this 15-minute meeting, and we would,
Was it scheduled just like
tie
any
it,
normal one?
it was all
Just go time
scheduled, and basically we supplied the technology to the patients, and all of a sudden, the results and the equivalency were the same. And so what we
So when you say equivalency, the clinical trial results were, it didn't matter whether they came in or not, basically the data was, that you were seeing the similar data. They were all the same treatment at this point?
Yep.
Wow.
And then in addition to that, so those are the simple visits. Then we have a little bit more complex visits where we may have to do, like you said, an infusion. We may have to do blood pressure, things of that nature. So what we did is we put clinical trials on wheels. And we loaded up vans, and we basically drove to the patient's house, and we bring the trial to the patient. And the amount of, like, I have goosebumps right now because of feeling that the families, the response that we got about what we were doing for their loved ones, and even if at the end of the day they didn't make it through the full disease progression, we made the whole experience for the family that much easier. And at the end of the day, the FDA has accepted these two, very simple approaches to reducing the impact on that patient and blessed our protocol to move forward.
That's fantastic. It's fantastic. I mean, I'm reminded actually by a whole variety of different things, because that's not really about 100x less, but that's about 100x better experience for the patients. And one of the things we always struggle with is clinical trial participation. I guess I'll ask the audience again. I like hands up. Is how many people have participated in a clinical trial in this audience? Anybody? 1, 2, looks like it's a handful, 3 people. And you consider, one of the challenges we've got is participation. Most of us don't participate because, for a whole variety of reasons, not least of that experience. I know, talking about Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, one of the insights that a client did, they identified that when you actually do the visits, often the mother is the person who's the carer, and they have other children. And so the CRA was taking food for the other kids so they could keep the kids occupied while they had mum involved with a DMD patient. Maybe, John, last but not least, we got a few minutes, three and a half minutes to go.
I'm standing between the exciting pitches. And
yeah, so this better be exciting, John.
Yeah, I know, no kidding. And I'm following
down.
that great story. I don't have a puppy or anything.
That's it.
We'll get you a puppy.
Come on, I need something.
I wanted to ask you about, you got a wealth of experience here, and I guess, if you had 3 lessons learned, what would those lessons learned be? And maybe kind of, if you can, to a certain extent, a little bit of a story around where those lessons came from, John.
Yeah, so my background, just so everybody knows, I've been a startup entrepreneur 8 times, and I've transitioned, unlike our lead-in speaker, from that world of being a serial entrepreneur into being an entrepreneur in residence or being...
So you went the other way.
I went the other way, and now I'm
Perfect.
inside a big corporation, and I went first to a corporation in another industry, but with the same idea, which is about how do you take all these great innovative ideas, whether they're happening internally or externally, they're being brought to you or they're being developed inside, and protect them from the mother panda. Like the point of this is that as an entrepreneur who's operating outside, you have all kinds of forces and things that you are up against that are super hard. They're really challenging. Raising money, dealing on the sales cycle, the development cycle, even approval cycles. But when you are inside a corporation, you've got all kinds of other things, budgets, zero-based budgeting. You've got, the fights for turf, the fights for people. I mean, in some organizations today, even, they're not adding new people. So even the idea that you're going to start and separate out a new group of people to do something becomes nearly impossible. And I think a couple of the things that I've learned, one is that it's the best of times and the worst of times. If you're an entrepreneur, there are so many, the sort of siren call of, we better innovate in the healthcare space because the world is changing, that it's being heard. So there's lots of opportunities. People are bringing, we're bringing in, and other organizations are bringing in entrepreneurs and startups in record numbers. The problem is that if you're not of the size and scale, or you haven't built a business case with the business that actually allows us to see how it's going to be a material change in our business, you're going to get a pilot inside our organization, but then you're going to be in Pilot Island. And we have pilot islands, all over the organization where...
We love pilot islands. It's fantastic.
Every
pilot's successful. They all work.
Exactly.
Everyone's a hero.
They're always working great. And because, depending on the budget, it's not very much money or no money at all. And they get to have our logo and wander around and tell everybody about it. So we've now actually got this whole test where we ask people, are you actually generating revenue? Have you grown your business with other clients?
Maybe Netflix could run a series called Pilot Island.
It is. We call it. It is Pilot Island. Send them off to Pilot Island. No.
That's it.
I think the second thing is this idea of how do you fix it with the business and the business objectives. So we have tried a couple of different things inside of MedStar. We had a couple of. We could use telehealth as an initiative that we took it into the business early. So we saw telehealth as a the future of a big part of our business. And so the idea was like, how can we scale this quickly? So we took it right into the business. The problem is that if you're running a P&L and now all of a sudden you're having to deal with this idea that the telehealth visit is half the price, maybe it's not reimbursed, how do you schedule it, how do you use it? Like it becomes a huge cost center, not a huge revenue generator. And so suddenly everybody's looking at it in the wrong sort of way. There's no innovation going on around it. There's how do I sit on it and destroy it? So we have this, in our innovation center, the Innovation Institute, we've developed these innovation centers. So we have a telehealth innovation center, which is experimenting, actually pulled out of the business. It sits in the innovation center, but it co-ops and works together with people across the business to develop business models in telehealth and get them to enough scale with the right technologies that we can then put them back into the business. So it's sort of a reverse way of thinking about it. You got to get the right mass behind it. You got to do it in a sort of walled off way, in a walled off garden. But then you've got to figure out how to build it into the business. So you got to have the business sponsorship and others. But it is a much more effective model for us than just starting it too early, or on the other hand, just bringing people into pilot island.
Perfect.
Either one don't tend to work for us very well.
It's perfect, John. I'm going to end it with a quick fire round that I'm going to ask you all the same question. It's like, so what's your top piece of advice to the people in the room here? What's your number one piece of advice? I'm going to ask everyone that question. John, because you got to go last, you now get to go first. And then we're going to wrap it up from there. So John, top piece of advice?
I would say really come to us with a very compelling business case. Understand the business well enough, not just to say, there's a $1 trillion cost in this area in the world, and it's going to save you half of whatever it is it's costing you. Come in and really explain to us how you've gone in and you understand our business, and build a case before you come to us. Don't ask us to do your work, and we see that just way too often today.
Perfect. Addison, what have you got for us?
Yeah, probably to riff off of that is specifically given the businesses that we all have. For instance, when you come to the payer, you're looking for us to, for instance, figure out how to reimburse, so that you can kind of get paid for what you're bringing. And, again, to the point of doing your homework, researching, and think about how this is going to fit into a system of innovation, not just, kind of this shiny object that's sitting all over to the side that we're not really, it's not going to be easy to integrate into anything that we're doing. So bringing those views as to how this fits into the system of the business process that we actually have to support.
Perfect. That's good. Juanjo?
So be very clear on what you want to achieve. What are the outcomes that you are pursuing? And then be relentless in pursuing them. But then don't be too relentless and fail very quickly and realize that you should stop once things are not working.
Love
I
it.
think
Amy?
for the startups that we work with, I would say be willing to say no to us more often, because I feel like the sales cycle goes on too long, and you need to be able to say
slow
no or
avoid the
walk
slow
away.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Nancy, last but not least.
For me, it's going to be that we need to embrace innovation, and we need to be comfortable to fail and fail fast and know it's okay. And learn from those innovations, because you might not fail all the way. Pick it back up and push it forward and get it 75%, fail it again until it's done. And don't be afraid, and stand up for yourselves, and let this industry know. Fail fast, fail early, it's okay. We do it every day. We bring drugs to market and we don't bring them. So I think we got to eat our own dog food, because that's what we do. We make drugs and we do fail fast all day long in discovery.
Perfect way to finish.
It's the same thing.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Juanjo. Thank you, Addison. Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for a great panel. Thank you very much.